This lecture discusses types of evidence. Last week we discussed logos, ethos, and pathos, which are rhetorical appeals that arguers use to persuade an audience. Some of the strategies for making those appeals that I discussed last week can also be framed as types of evidence. So this is another way of looking at the tools that arguers are using, just a little less about style and a little more about substance. Our goal at the moment is to look for these elements while reading. When thinking about evidence, let's not forget to ask, evidence for what? What is the evidence supporting? So I don't want to lose sight of the claims, the point sentences that provide structure for the argument. As I mentioned last week, writing a summary paragraph is a good strategy to help you visualize the structure of an argument, because you identify the main point sentences and then you paraphrase them in a paragraph. So in this example, we have a summary paragraph of Katie Bishop's article, Why Are Millennials and Gen Z Turning to Instagram as a News Source? And in this summary paragraph that was written by students and pulled together various paraphrases from students into a summary, we can see that the thesis is present, a paraphrase of Bishop's thesis is present, a paraphrase of one of her ideas, and then another is presented in this summary paragraph. So this can be useful, summary writing can be useful for looking at someone else's argument and analyzing, so that you can see these idea sentences up right next to each other. That's a lot of what happens in a summary paragraph, is you're putting the ideas right next to each other, and you can see if they're strongly connected, you can see if they're related, and when you read the summary paragraph, you can see gaps, right? If the summary paragraph doesn't make sense, or if there's something that seems to be missing, right, that can help you with determining whether the argument you're looking at is a strong one. When you have a clear sense of an argument structure, then you can look more closely at the evidence used. And I've tried to associate each type of evidence that we're going to discuss in this lecture with the main appeal that they serve. So field research or field observations, they might make a logical appeal. This is when someone perhaps picks a location to sit and observe people, or sit and observe natural phenomenon, or maybe it's a camera they set up. Maybe they visit a place over a set period of time in order to record notes. This type of evidence can give the feeling of scientific credibility to an argument. It increases typicality, which means that it will likely have a large enough sample size. This can enhance the ethos of the writer as personally invested, because usually the writer is the person who conducted the field research or the observations. Someone who is skeptical, however, might point to flaws in how the observations were conducted. So as we think about each type of evidence, we also want to think about not only what might make the evidence good, but what might make the evidence weak. So we'll think about the skeptic's point of view as well. Questionnaires and surveys can provide solid support for an argument. They often can produce a large enough sample size for the information to present a typical scenario, and there's often enough evidence that can be gained from this type of technique, so that enhances what we call sufficiency. You can uncover local or recent data this way that's not available in published research, which usually takes longer. But skeptics can raise doubts about the research methodology and what types of questions were selected for the survey and who received the survey. So we can always ask questions. Research studies, which are sometimes called case studies, if you're searching databases, for example, to find evidence, these are sometimes conducted in a laboratory. These could be clinical studies, these could be sociological studies, psychological studies, scientific studies. They're often powerful when the sources are respected by the audience. They can suggest thoroughness in the investigation, but you can, of course, raise some doubt about the credentials of the source. Statistical data can often be used for evidence, and this can be calculated and displayed in different ways, which would have potentially a different rhetorical effect. So it's really important when it comes to statistical data for an argument that that data is presented in a clear way. Skeptics might question the method. Skeptics might also question the presentation. For example, do we receive raw numbers versus percentages? If we only have percentages, we might not know what the sample size was. And that can actually give you a wrong impression. Are we getting the median versus the mean? A mean is an average, a median suggests where people fall in the middle. So these can create different impressions as well. Have the numbers been adjusted, and is there any sort of notation that the numbers have been adjusted? Is there a base point for comparison? That can be very helpful when we get percentages, for example, for there to be a base point. So this is something you want to be careful about, and something you also want to notice when others present statistical data is how those numbers are being presented and what's the best way to promote accuracy. Another type of evidence is what we might call testimony, and this could be testimony from witnesses or testimony from experts. And this one can really straddle all three appeals. These are recounts of direct experience, and they can enhance the authority of the argument. This can be persuasive if the source of the testimony has impressive credentials or has a clear relationship with the subject matter. Skeptics might raise questions about those credentials, however. So one thing to notice when encountering someone else's argument or in writing your own, something to think about is presenting the background of the expert that you're including in your argument, for example. In this case, professional experience can make an ethical appeal if it's the author, if it's the arguer themselves, if it's the writer who's discussing their own professional experience that relates to the topic. This can demonstrate the writer's knowledgeable. It can be a way that their credibility in the field is established. There might be some questions raised about bias, but this shows the writer's connection to the issue. Similarly, an arguer might present personal experience for evidence. They might not necessarily have a professional relationship with the subject matter, but they might have a personal one, and so they can show connections to the issue that way. Often personal experience has a narrative element, and so vivid stories can capture the imagination of the reader. It can engage the senses, but you often will hear skeptics argue that personal experience is insufficient, so not being the only type of evidence in an argument is something to think about. Interviews can fall somewhere between logos and pathos in their appeals, because interviews can often be very scientific, but also at the same time when someone's being interviewed, usually they're recounting some personal experience. And so, and similar to what I just described, there can be an emotional appeal that way, an imaginative appeal, a sensory appeal. So this can enhance sufficiency and typicality of evidence, because the more people interviewed, the larger the sample size, the more closely representative it might be. You can uncover local or recent data this way that's not available in published research. Again, these can be engaging personal stories, but there's always questions about the research methodology, the interview methodology, who was chosen to interview, how were the interviews conducted, so those questions can be raised. Narratives might be used, little stories, for support, and it might be the writer's own narrative, a personal narrative, but it might be narratives about other people telling a little story about someone else who was affected by the issue, for example. And these can appeal to pathos because they will often utilize concrete language, details that increase the liveliness of the text and heighten that emotional connection. Again, they can appeal to readers imaginations, and often emotions are engaged. In fact, you'll see some emotional language sometimes in those narratives where the arguer is pointing out that the person being described is feeling sad or feeling fear or feeling determined, for example. You might utilize hypothetical examples, or an arguer might use hypothetical examples if there isn't a lot of research available about an issue. These can have strong imaginative appeal, so you might present a possible scenario you could see happening in the future, for example. They're only going to be persuasive, however, if they seem plausible, if they seem like they're possible, there's some realistic element to that hypothetical example. So as I've discussed these types of evidence, and again, mostly what we're doing is noticing when arguers use them, when other people use evidence in a article that we're reading or perhaps in a video. And you've heard me say these words in this video lecture: sufficiency, typicality, accuracy, and relevance, which we can use the acronym STAR to help us remember the STAR criteria. So sufficiency, is there enough evidence? That's a question that you always want to ask for an argument. Has enough evidence been presented? Typicality, is the chosen evidence representative and typical? Is it perhaps a large enough sample size, or is it span enough of the geographical scope, for example, so that we can trust the information that's being presented? Is it accurate? Are there no errors? And is it current? Is it up to date? And then relevance, is the evidence actually clearly connected to the issue that's being argued? That's not always the case. And so that's something that you want to be careful of when you're writing your own argument. You want to notice when you're evaluating someone else's.